Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World Centre speaker series. My name is Philip Gooding. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the IOWC at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. As many of you will know, the IOWC speaker series has for around a decade been an in-person event held in McGill University, usually in Peterson Hall, in which established and emerging scholars alike have presented their research to a community of scholars largely based in Montreal and its surrounds. Unfortunately, in winter 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic put a stop to these activities, and its persistence has meant that we've been unable to recommence them. Thus, instead, and for the time being at least, we've decided to relaunch the IOWC Speaker Series as an online event. This follows the success of an online international conference organized by the IOWC on environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world, which was held in May 2021, as well as the success of the Indian Ocean World podcast, in which members of the IOWC team interview scholars from across the humanities and social scientists on their research in matters pertaining to the environment in the Indian Ocean world. I will add links to these activities in the chat box for all of those of you who are interested. They're all open access and accessible. For those of you who are here live witnessing this presentation as it happens, I would like to mention now that we are recording this event, although I will stop recording before the beginning of the Q&A session. Thus, if you have a question for our presenter, you don't have to worry if you don't want that question and its response to be broadcast on the internet. The presentation itself will be posted on the IOWC's YouTube channel, enabling scholars in other time zones easier access to the core materials. Now to get to the business of this event itself. It is my pleasure to introduce someone who to most here probably needs no introduction at all, Professor Gwyn Campbell. Professor Campbell is the director of the IOWC, and so it is fitting that he opens this relaunch of the IOWC Speaker Series as an online event. Professor Campbell is also the general editor of the Palgrave series in Indian Ocean World Studies, as well as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Indian Ocean World Studies. His list of publications is extensive, but to draw your attention to two of his most recent book publications, Professor Campbell is the author of Africa and the Indian Ocean World from Early Times to Circa 1900, which was published in 2019 with Cambridge University Press, as well as The Travels of Robert Lyell, 1789 to 1831, Scottish surgeon, naturalist, and British agent to the court in Madagascar, which was published with Palgrave in 2020. And again, I will post links to these publications in the chat box. Today, Professor Campbell will present some related research building on his expertise in the history of Madagascar and its relationship with Britain in the early 19th century. His presentation is entitled Madagascar Youths in Britain, 1820 to 29. It will last 40 to 50 minutes and is after the presentation that I will stop recording and I will invite questions from the audience. If you have a question during that Q&A period, please put your hand up using the raise hand function in Zoom and I will invite you to speak. Professor Campbell, thank you for agreeing to present this research to us. I now hand over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Goodin, and I'm pleased to do this. It's a bit strange. It's the sort of pandemic format, but nevertheless, Zoom seems to cope with it quite well. So, as Dr. Goodin mentioned, the title is Madagascar Youths in Britain, 1820 to 29. Now, you may sort of query the notion of Madagascar Youths. Why am I using that instead of Malagasy Youths? And why youths? Well, that was the phrase that was used throughout the literature referring to this, the archives in Mauritius, in Madagascar, and in Britain mainly. Now, just as an introduction, in 1820, Radama I of Imerina in central Madagascar signed a treaty with the British based in Mauritius, in which he agreed to ban the slave export trade in return for financial, military, and technical assistance, and the British authorities accepting Malagasy youths for education and training in Britain, in Mauritius, and on British naval vessels. Now, what is remarkable about this, and it's hitherto been a sort of secret is that there was something like 100 Madagascar youths that were thus accepted. Today's talk, however, is only going to focus, we only have time for that, on those who went to Britain. And this comes from a book which is currently going to be published by, is currently in press and going to be published by Cambridge University Press. There you see the cover for it on the screen, and it'll be out later this year. Now, what I will go over is their selection. How were these youths selected? Who were they? Their reception, education, and training under the supervision of the London Missionary Society, the LMS. Their trials, tribulations, and successes in Britain, and how they changed British perceptions of the Malagasy. Now, to give you a bit of a background, there's certain key aspects that need to be understood in order to understand what's happening here. One is that the British captured Mauritius in 1810. They captured it from the French during the wars, the long wars with the French that ended in 1815. Why? Because the French on Mauritius and the neighboring island of Reunion had caused major embarrassment to the British in the Indian Ocean by attacking their fleets. So the British took Mauritius and Reunion. They gave Reunion back to the French in 1815, but they retained Mauritius because it had a superb harbor in Port Louis, and it was strategically placed on the route to India, which was the focus of their empire in the Indian Ocean. And the first governor of Mauritius is the man you see on the screen, Robert Farquhar, who quickly realized that a plantation economy, because on Mauritius they transformed, it was a cash crop economy, and they transformed from producing many crops to a single crop culture, a monoculture, which was sugar. And as they made that transition, the island, they tore down the forests on the island and they converted most of the suitable terrain on the island to sugar plantations. Therefore, there was a huge need on the island for cheap labor and for provisions. And the closest supplier of both was Madagascar. The problem being that hitherto, the Madagascar had supplied slaves. Now, Britain in 1807 had abolished the slave trade, so it was incumbent upon Farquhar to sign a treaty whereby he could obtain the provisions he wanted, he could obtain the cheap labor he wanted, but it couldn't be slave labor. So to sign a treaty with the dominant leader in Madagascar and enforce a slave export ban. And that, in Farquhar's mind, would release cheap labor, free labor, to come and serve on the plantations in Mauritius. Now here we see a map of Madagascar with Imerina right in the center. And these are the people that Farquhar decided to treaty with. And in return, as we said, in return for the treaty, he would give them military aid and recognize Radama as the king of all Madagascar. And he quickly, with British military aid and assistance, conquered the area that you see here in dark. And here is the island of Madagascar and Mauritius. So a ban on the slave export trade, most favored nation duty, sort of virtual free trade, a political agent resident at the Merina court, a man called Hasty, recognition of Radama as king of Madagascar, and then British technical assistance in return also in return for training a select group of Malagasy youths. This is James Hasty, who was the British agent who negotiated the treaty for Farquhar. And here is Radama this was taken or painted sometime after the British recognized him. So he's wearing splendid military uniform. He was a brilliant military commander, and he modeled himself, ironically, after Napoleon. Now, pivotal to Farquhar's aim to secure British hegemony in Madagascar were the Madagascar youths sent to Britain. Why? Because they would learn the English language, they would imbibe British culture, they would learn key skills, for example, textile manufacture, that upon their return might form the basis of industries to replace the slave trade. Also, they'd be exposed to Protestant worship and teaching. Some might convert to Christianity, and all would desire to retain the British alliance. On this basis, Farquhar persuaded the British government to cover their travel, accommodation, and training costs. And he persuaded the LMS, the London Missionary Society, to supervise their training and welfare in Britain. All of this was to have significant consequences for the way in which the LMS, the London Missionary Society, the government in London, and British society in general viewed Madagascar. So how did they select them? So very shortly, only 3 days after the treaty was signed in October 1820, Radama selected the first batch of youths to go to Britain. And an LMS missionary, David Jones, who was on site, he'd gone to Emerina with James Hastie, recorded of the event. The people entered into a high discussion as to who should have the king's permission, the honor to send their children to be instructed. One man said that he would give $3,000 for permission to send his child. Well, said the king, give me $1,500 and he shall go. The man hesitated a little and then answered that he would give that sum. Well, rejoined the king, as you are in earnest, he shall go for nothing. The place was on Saturday crowded by the richest and most respectable people in the capital, from among whose children a selection has been made for instruction. Now note that last sentence. The richest and most respectable people in the capital, from among whose children a selection has been made for instruction. So Radama chose exceptionally carefully. He chose from the most powerful amongst the Merina, amongst the elite, amongst the courtiers who would support him. In effect, he chose 9. There was going to be 10, but he chose 9. And 7 came, Madagascar has a caste system, and he chose 7 from the top Andriana, that's the lordly caste, 2 of whom were twins. He chose 1 from the Hoover, or the second-ranked caste, and surprisingly, he chose 1 who was a slave, which was in contravention of the treaty. And how it ever passed the British and the LMS and the evangelicals in Britain, I don't know, but he continued to be a slave, and upon his return was taken by the Merina court and maintained as a slave. The parents of all the children, except for Verki, the slave, contributed to the outfit for their sons. A 4-man Malagasy embassy and Hastie travelled back to Mauritius with the youths. And from Mauritius, a 2-man Malagasy embassy and a British agent, not Hastie, travelled with the youths to Britain. The 2-man Malagasy embassy comprised Ratefi, who was a brother-in-law of Radama, had been educated in the royal school in the capital in Antananarivo in Emerina, and was literate in Surabaya, which was Malagasy written in Arabic script. He was the commander-in-chief, second only to Radama. So this was an extremely important, significant choice. And he sent as a support for Ratefi, Andrea Mahazunuru, an anti-Muru scribe, who was completely literate in Surabaya. In fact, he was probably one of those who taught Ratefi in the school in Antananarivo. The Mauritian government officer who accompanied them was George Harrison, who carried letters of introduction from Farquhar for Ratefi addressed to George IV and to Farquhar's family members in England. They sailed from Port Louis on the 16th of January, 1821, and reached Britain on the 14th of May. So a 4-month voyage. Now, this ship in the center is the Andromach, and that was used later on to train Malagasy youths with the British Navy. But that's an indication of the sort of vessel they would have traveled on. And then you see here a map of the route that they would have had to have taken. And of course, the Suez Canal had not been built. And this area, the Red Sea, was anyway controlled by Ottoman powers. So for any Western European power to access the Indian Ocean, they had to travel the Atlantic route. And of course, that was sail, so they were dependent upon winds and currents. The outward journey was long. In order to capture the winds and currents that were necessary, they had to travel all the way to Rio de Janeiro, down on the Latin American coast, 9,200 kilometers, then across the South Atlantic to Cape Town, and then on to Mauritius, a journey of 6,000 kilometers. The return voyage was simpler. They could cut up past West Africa and straight to Britain, only 3,300 kilometers. Now, people from other, in inverted commas, exotic regions had already visited Britain. It included a minimum of 16 Pacific Islanders, who, since the voyages of James Cook, had been the focus of intense scientific and missionary attention in Britain. However, the Malagasy group, when they arrived in Britain, were the largest Malagasy group ever to have arrived, and they caused a public sensation. Why? Well, first, their visit was a result of a treaty, the core clause of which was a ban on slave exports from Madagascar. And remember that the British had in 1807 passed an anti-slave trade law, and slavery in Britain had largely ended by the end of the 19th century. So this was seen as of enormous significance by the humanitarian network comprising prominent British parliamentarians and evangelicals. At the time, there were thousands of non-Europeans in Britain who were generally, by the British, termed black, although they were of both African and Asian origin. The majority, including almost all non-European females, were in domestic service. A minority belonged to the black labor aristocracy, skilled workers, entertainers, boxers, but they were outnumbered by beggars, African and Asian beggars. The streets of London, for example, were full of destitute non-Europeans. Many of the Asian and African males were ex-British Army or Navy, or deserters from merchant vessels. And they were concentrated in the major ports, London, Liverpool, Cardiff, Bristol. And black seamen, unlike Asian lascars, were regarded as British, as were black soldiers. And in hard times were theoretically entitled to poor relief. And some non-Europeans in Britain married local women. Now, the Madagascar youths were automatically considered to be part of the black community, although immediately the British noticed a difference. Most of the group were Highland Mariner, and they had Indonesian colouring and features. And they themselves, that is the Mariner, differentiated themselves sharply from Africans. So Raumbana, one of the youths, stated, "The English were surprised, but very agreeably, by the appearance of these strangers. For I'm certain that in England it was thought that the Malagasy would facially and physically resemble Mozambicans or Hottentots, and that they were cannibals. But now," that is after they arrived in Britain, "but now it was found that all, except Verki, remember the slave, were different from Africans, and with their olive complexion and European type noses, looked much more like Europeans, not at all like flat-nosed, frizzy-haired Mozambicans or Hottentots." Members of London society were also surprised to learn that the Malagasy had a sovereign who had sent a prince, Retief, to Britain as his ambassador, and that Retief was literate. He brought a letter from Radama in French. Radama had learned French, and 2 to 3 of the group, Retief, Andrew Mahazunuru, who was his secretary, and possibly Verki, because Verki, that is the slave, had spent time on Mauritius, were literate in Surabaya, and Verki was definitely literate in French and English. Now, these factors automatically put the Malagasy on a separate footing from sub-Saharan Africans and Pacific Islanders. And they obliged the British to reevaluate Madagascar and the Malagasy in their classification of civilizations. And that classification was based on institutions. In other words, did they have a monarchy? On skin color and on literacy. Retief duly met George IV and celebrated abolitionists such as Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce, and the London Missionary Society elite. He visited Woolwich Armoury and was very impressed by the military might of the British. And he transmitted to the LMS Radama's desire for both educator and artisan missionaries. The LMS, in their turn, invited him to the 27th Annual General Meeting, where evangelical preacher Rowland Hill pushed through a motion that the meeting presented to Prince Retief its most respectful acknowledgements for the honour of his presence, and begs that he will express to King Radama the lively gratitude which the Society feels for the gracious reception which he has given the Reverend David Jones. Remember, that was the missionary who had accompanied Hastie to Madagascar at the signing of the treaty. To the Reverend David Jones, one of its missionaries, and that he will assure His Majesty of its earnest desire to meet the wishes which are contained in the letter which he has done the directors the honour of addressing to them. Now, Retief, they insisted that Retief have an engraving done of himself in London, and here he is. And you will note that his hair is short. So Retief had almost immediately, maybe under pressure from the LMS, cut his hair upon arrival. And when he went back to Madagascar, he persuaded Radama, the king, to do likewise. And Radama insisted that all his soldiers similarly have their hair cut short, much to the chagrin of the Malagasy women who preferred their men with long hair. Now here you have an embassy later in the century, and you can see how they were dressed. And they've all got short hair, of course, but this is typical. The trousers are not typical, but they've got typical sort of Malagasy over a cloth over them. This is called a lamba, and this would have been in silk and brightly coloured. Now, the visit of this Malagasy royal sparked enormous interest in Madagascar and the LMS mission in Madagascar. The AGM, the LMS AGM, was packed, and members of the London elite, whether they were evangelicals or not, inundated Retief with invitations. And he had his portrait executed, as you've seen. The LMS was so impressed by a non-Black literate prince that they immediately upgraded Madagascar from being savage African to a semi-civilized Eastern pagan island. And they selected as a missionary to Madagascar to accompany Retief back, John Jeffreys, an Englishman. Prior to that, they'd chosen Welsh peasants who might suit a savage African context, but not a semi-civilized one. So they've upgraded the missionary scale. They've chosen an English missionary who was a graduate of the elite Blackburn Independent Academy and had classical and some medical training. He accompanied Retief back to Madagascar in mid-1821. Not only that, but Madagascar dress became a source of unrivaled attraction, eagerly sought after by ladies of the first eminence, and men in elite circles in London started to dress as Madagascar chiefs at fancy dress balls. And you can imagine the sort of array that they might have chosen. These are some of the pictures that were circulating of Malagasy at the time. Now, the LMS, who were charged with supervising the education and training of the Madagascar youths, sent them to the British and Foreign School Society Borough Road School. Now, this was run on educational principles of Joseph Lancaster, whereby the eldest students taught the younger ones. And it was primarily brought in by Lancaster to serve the poor in the borough of Southwark in London. But what the British and Foreign School Society did was widen it from a British poor to a global school. So they started accepting youth from elsewhere. So prior to 1821, pupils included between 2 and 4 African youths and many from other regions. The schools were packed. The male school had 500 students, and it was always packed, and there was a waiting list. And the female school had 300. This is a picture of the school. And here you see a picture of the class, the boys' school, and with visiting dignitaries to see how it was run. It became world famous, at least European famous, and it was used as a model on the continent as well as in Britain. And it spread to the US. Now, what of the youths themselves? There are 9 of them. Well, in January 1822, one of them, Yekutu Mavu, was diagnosed with consumption, that is tuberculosis, which was rampant in British cities in the early 19th century. And most of those Pacific Islanders referred to had in Britain died of it. And he died in early March aboard the ship that was going to return him to Madagascar. The British government decided that he was too ill and planned to return him. Another youth, Ramisa, who was by far the eldest of the youths, most of them were aged 9 when they arrived in Britain. He was 22 years old, and he had a wife and family back in Madagascar. And he just, he thought, I can't go through this. I miss my wife and family too much. He gave up, and he left with Prince Retief and with Jeffreys, the new missionary. So we have 7 remaining Madagascar youths. They made good progress at Borough Road School, and from mid to late 1822, the London Missionary Society assigned 4 to skills, so these are crafts in which non-whites represented only 0.8% of total craftsmen. In other words, the LMS had reclassified them and considered them of superior rank to common English apprentices. The other 3 were appointed to Manchester to undertake a liberal education in a nonconformist elite academy. Now, of the 4 that were sent to learn skills, it's of note that the LMS was utterly untroubled about the morality of training in weapons, which also, incidentally, helped fuel the African slave trade. They sent them Verki to learn gunpowder manufacture, Rambua to learn the manufacture of guns, and Ramisa, who had left, had initially been designed to learn the production of cannons. So if we first look at Verki, sent to learn gunpowder manufacture, they sent him to Waltham Abbey Gunpowder Manufactory, which is about 30 kilometers from Borough Road School. And he served his apprenticeship under John Braddock, who ran the entire place. It was the most, at the time, the most famous producer of gunpowder in Britain. The problem being that Dr. John A. Gillam, who the LMS had appointed to supervise the health of the youths whilst they were in London, warned them that Verki's poor health, and the question mark, was it tuberculosis, was in poor health and should return to Madagascar. What about Rambua? He was chosen to go to Birmingham, which was the gun producing centre of Britain. And he was apprenticed to an unknown gunmaker. This is unfortunate. I've gone through the archives and didn't find anything about who he was apprenticed to. On the right, you see here a painting by Turner of an industrial town at sunset, and probably Birmingham or Dudley. He spent a year in Birmingham and then promptly fled without warning. He walked 200 kilometers back to London, back to Borough Road School, at an average of 51 kilometers a day. The LMS sought immediately to send him back to Birmingham, but the prospect caused Rambua to go mad, and Dr. Gillam declared him in an insane state of mind, liable to acts of violence. Now, that obviously indicates he'd spent a year in Birmingham. It seems to me to indicate that that something had happened to him just before he'd fled. Something unfortunate. We simply don't know what it was. Gillam had him committed to a lunatic asylum called the Retreat in Clapham, run by George Mann Burroughs, who applied scientific psychiatry modeled after the Parisian hospital practices. It was a famous retreat. It had famous patients. In 1829, they included a surgeon, a silversmith, a wine merchant, a bricklayer, 4 clerks, and 2 army officers. In June 1824, Gillam re-examined Rambua, decided that he'd improved enough to let him go, but recommended that he be returned to Madagascar. And Bathurst, in the Colonial Office, authorized his passage back. So what about the others? Well, Razafin Karefu had been sent to Manchester for a liberal education, entered an elite nonconformist academy, but in the winter of 1823-4 fell seriously ill, was sent to the seaside to breathe the air and put his paddle in the sea, but the treatment failed, and it was decided that he should be sent back to Madagascar with Verki and Rambua. So the 3 of them, in October 1824, shortly before they left, were baptized. And it wasn't an ordinary baptism. This was a huge event. It was something that the evangelicals embraced. They were, first of all, baptized by a famous evangelical preacher called John Angel James, of Birmingham, who was called, quote, a national authority on matters spiritual. And the place chosen for their baptism was Rowland Hill's Surrey Chapel in Blackfriars Road, Southwark, London. Verkey, by the way, adopted the baptismal name Joseph. Now, this is Surrey Chapel from the outside, so a hugely respectable building. And here you see inside and the crowds that would have assembled to watch this baptism. And these would all be leading evangelicals, leading anti-slave traders, anti-slave movement people, and others of the London elite. The baptism was considered a major victory for Christianity in its fight against the heathen world, and in what the directors, the LMS directors, called a deeply interesting and numerously attended service. It was reported, Matt, that the young men were dressed in European fashion and possessed open and pleasing countenances. About 11 o'clock, the chapel doors were opened and the interior soon filled with a highly respectable congregation, the majority of which were composed of elegantly dressed ladies, all of whom seemed to take a deep interest on the occasion. The three youths, the eldest of whom appeared to be about 18, were conducted into the chapel by the Reverend Mr. James and took their seats immediately under the pulpit. Now you can imagine down here what that was like. The young men were dressed in European fashion, and we've got that. None of their features except their color resembling the natives on the part of, sorry, this is slightly mixed, resemble the natives of that part of the continent of Africa, which is contiguous to Madagascar. They sailed on the 30th of October, arriving, reaching Mauritius in February 1825, and then awaited the dry season. Remember, Madagascar lies in the southern hemisphere, so they awaited the dry season, the winter season, the non-malarial season. They waited until April before they sent them to Madagascar with Hasty. Two of the other youths who were selected for craft training, Andrinaivo and Ralumbeluna, were in November 1822, after finishing at Borough Road School, sent to Manchester to learn the art of manufacturing calico. They boarded with a highly respectable nonconformist minister called the Reverend John Clooney, who also happened to be the founder and principal of the elite nonconformist academies in Leaf Square and Seedley Grove, Manchester. He placed them in a factory, and by January 1823, it was reported that they had woven 2 pieces of calico about 80 yards each. These were sent to London, where the LMS directors examined them and were so impressed that they had them forwarded to Madagascar, accompanied by a letter to Radama, explanatory of the particulars regarding their production. So this is a picture of a Manchester cotton mill in 1820, somewhere where this is the sort of establishment, respectable establishment they'd have been placed, and the interior of the mill. However, despite the excitement of the LMS at their ability to learn the craft, a famous physician called Thomas Jarrold, addressing the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester, cautioned the British public about the semi-barbaric nature of the Madagascar youths. He said, "They have acquired a knowledge of our language, they imitate our manners, and copy everything they are desired. In school talents, they equal the European children of the same age, but their first impressions were received in Madagascar. And though they were not more than 9 years old when they arrived in England, they have not lost their national character and national character is dependent upon early impressions. They take a certain station among their school fellows, yet there is a want of assimilation. The character of a people so far advanced in civilization as they is more complex than in a more barbarous age. But to meet the subject fully, I have included the semi-barbarous with the civilized, and have taken our own country as an example, that is England as being civilized. I may here remark that when early impressions are mentioned, it's intended to be understood that influence which the mental and moral character of the individual who has the care of a child has on its, that the influence the individual who has the care of the child has on its instinctive faculty, on the child's instinctive faculty. Moreover, Manchester in the 1820s was a highly unhealthy place to live. The cotton textile sector boomed. It attracted thousands of immigrants. In the 1820s, the population of Manchester and Salford increased from 162,000 to 238,000, a 47% increase. It had poor living and working conditions, high rates of illness. Children under 10 comprised 50% and over of the city's deaths. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, Andrea Niver contracted tuberculosis and died on the 19th of May, 1824, aged 15. Just before he died, he asked to be baptized, at which event, this is the LMS reporting this, he showed pleasing evidence of real conversion. It was commented that his remains were interred at New Windsor, the pole being supported by the 4 remaining Madagascar youths, and the whole of the students of the academy joining in the funeral procession, with black crepe and white favours on their arms. Roland Belliner continued his apprenticeship in weaving, dyeing, and additionally academic studies. By late 1825, he was considered sufficiently acquainted with the arts of weaving and dyeing. And in February 26 was baptized John in Grosvenor Street Chapel, Manchester. And in May 26, 1826, sailed from Gravesend, accompanied by LMS missionary recruits. He arrived in Mauritius in July and in Madagascar in August. Now, what about the twins? These now were pretty much the only ones left in Britain. They were allocated a liberal education, and it was intended by Radama that upon their return they would serve as royal councillors and foreign secretaries. It happens that their experiences are particularly well documented because they did become foreign secretaries, so their correspondence with European countries, foreign countries in general, has been preserved, and they were remarked on by European visitors. More than that, and this is extremely interesting, is that Rawumbana wrote a history and kept a diary in secret and in English, and both have survived. They're largely extant. They went from Borough Road School to Manchester, received a liberal education at Leaf Square Academy under Clooney. They studied English, geography, arithmetic, rhetoric, geometry, history, and chemistry. And in June 1825, Cheney, one of their tutors, informed the LMS that they were playful and volatile, but appear quite ingenious and affectionate. Indeed, they all do whatever they are ordered with pleasure and appear extremely happy. In mid-1825, Hanera came 5th in his class, and in May 1826, following Ralumbana's return, the twins were the only Madagascar youths remain in. In January 1827, they started to learn French. And in 1828, Rawumbana gained the Academy's silver medal for academic merit. All of this was followed and recorded in evangelical journals. By that time, by 1827, 1828, they were also addressing evangelical gatherings in Manchester, the north of England, possibly North Wales, and making friends with prominent evangelical families in that region, in both regions. However, by 1827, Rawumbana's health was declared delicate. He was suffering from ulcers. And in June 1828, it was decided to send both twins back to Madagascar. They left, they went to London in August, and the same month, August, Radama I of Madagascar died, and his successor, Ranavalana I, demanded the twins return. This news, of course, didn't reach London for some time, but the youths were, the two twins were already on their way. In September, they sailed under the supervision of Lachlan Grant, an assistant army surgeon, arrived in Port Louis, Mauritius, in November 1828, where Rawumbana was declared restored to health. And they, like the other youths, waited for the dry, non-malarial season before they sailed for Madagascar, arriving in Tamatave, Madagascar's main east coast port, in June 1829, and then the capital, Antananarivo, in July. They were warmly greeted by their mother, who had survived the trip, and by Ranavalana I, who immediately appointed them royal secretaries and councillors. They remained faithful to the Merina crown until their deaths, Rawumbana in 1855, Rahanirika in 1862, but, and remember what Farquhar, why he wanted the Madagascar youth sent to Britain, they also did their utmost to promote the British political and cultural cause. And although they didn't become Christians, they protected Malagasy Christians who from 1835 were persecuted by the Merina state. In 1835, Ranavalana banned Christianity. And Rawumbana, in his secret history and his journal, despite being a royal secretary, often wrote damning things about Ranavalana and her policies, which is a highly dangerous thing for him to do. She had no, she would not hesitate to have killed him had she found out. So to sum up, this is a chart of the youths who were sent to Britain, given their status, their assignment, the type of work that they were sent there to do, and what happened. So only a few of them returned well to Madagascar, but of those, 3 of them made an impact. That was 4 of them made an impact. That was Verki, who was employed in gunpowder manufacture, Rambellina, who was employed initially in textiles and then subsequently in politics as a diplomat, and then the twins, Rawumbana and Rahanirika, who served the Malagasy state as royal secretaries, councillors, and generally promoted the British cause at a time when the British, after 1835, were highly unpopular. So thank you very much. And now we hand it back to Dr. Goodin.